In May 2024, riots broke out in the semi-autonomous French overseas territory of New Caledonia. This led Paris to declare a 12-day state of emergency, while French troops were deployed to secure the international airport located just outside the capital, Nouméa. Nevertheless, over the next few days, as authorities tried to regain control over parts of the island of Grande Terre, 7 people would be killed and more than 300 injured. Looting and other destruction stemming from the riots has so far cost nearly 200 million euros in damages. And while perhaps not as important in the grand scheme of things, on March 17th it was also announced the torch relay for the upcoming Paris Olympics would not pass through New Caledonia in June as had originally been planned. So what exactly is going on here? Well, for this episode we're going to be doing something a little different and looking into the current situation over in New Caledonia. We'll briefly touch upon the island's more recent history, which plays a role in the unrest we're seeing today, but mainly we'll be focusing on the here and now. Think of this like a Ghost Country's newsflash. And in future episodes, we might even discuss multiple topics. If, however, you'd like to know more about New Caledonia's past, you should check out this video we did a while back, which covers events prior to the 20th century. New Caledonia was first discovered by Europeans when James Cook, a British explorer, spotted the archipelago on September 4, 1774. France later took possession of most of the archipelago in 1853 and established a penal colony. Then, in 1946, New Caledonia became a French overseas territory. Following World War II, a nickel boom in the early 1970s brought a significant number of European and Polynesian immigrants. This is rather important because, for the first time in their history, indigenous Melanesian people such as the Kanak became a minority on New Caledonia, although they still represented the largest single ethnic group in the archipelago. Between 1976 and 1988, a period known as the Événements saw conflict between French authorities, the Kandouche, a name given to the European inhabitants of New Caledonia, and groups like the Kanak and Socialist Liberation Front, or FLNKS. All of this culminated in the Uvia Cave hostage-taking, in which Kanak separatists armed with machetes, axes, and a handful of guns killed 4 French soldiers, 2 of whom were unarmed, wounded 5 others, and seized 27 hostages. Shortly after this, on May 5th, the Nouméa Accord was signed, which laid out a 20-year transition period for giving the overseas territory greater autonomy. It also guaranteed a series of referendums on whether New Caledonia would remain a special collectivity of France or become an independent state. As per the accord, voting in local elections, including referendums, was limited to Kanak, those living in New Caledonia before 1998, and their descendants who had maintained continuous residency in the territory for at least 10 years. All New Caledonians could, nevertheless, vote in French national elections. New Caledonia held its first referendum back in 2018, with some 56% of voters rejecting independence. A second referendum occurred in 2020, with 53% of voters rejecting independence. The yes vote had gained some ground, though, so there was some optimism among pro-independence parties of a possible future victory. A third and more than likely final referendum was then held in 2021, in which 96% of voters rejected independence. Turnout, however, was only around 43% because most pro-independence political parties boycotted the 2021 referendum. But why? Well, this all took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused nearly 300 deaths among the Kanak, who, according to custom, were then expected to observe mourning rituals that can last for up to 1 year. Kanak leaders therefore requested the referendum be postponed. However, loyalist political parties, i.e. those opposed to independence, argued this merely was a means of using the pandemic to justify postponing a referendum the opposition believed they could not win. And in the end, it went ahead as planned. After which, French President Emmanuel Macron celebrated the results, claiming that France is more beautiful because New Caledonia has decided to stay a part of it. What's more, Macron described the overseas territory as now being free from the binary choice of yes or no. FLNKS, however, rejected the 2021 referendum and unsuccessfully challenged the results' validity in court on the basis of low turnout. The Pacific Islands Forum, an intergovernmental organization that aims to enhance cooperation among countries and territories in Oceania, agreed the referendum was an inaccurate representation of the will of registered voters, but it didn't believe the results should be annulled. Another intergovernmental organization, the Melanesian Spearhead Group, went a step further, saying the referendum was itself invalid. A transition period was nonetheless scheduled, during which yet another referendum on the new status for New Caledonia within the French Republic would take place. That being said, replacing the Nouméa Accord would require constitutional change. Macron, however, hinted at possible reform here, including unfreezing voter rolls, which would make more French nationals eligible to vote. And that was that, until early 2024, when the French government began discussing a revision of the constitution that would unfreeze the electorate in New Caledonia, keeping only a rolling 10-year residency requirement. Okay, so remember, as per the Nouméa Accord, voting in local elections, including referendums, was limited to Kanak, those living in New Caledonia before 1998, and their descendants who maintained continuous residency in the territory for 10 years. This so-called frozen electorate rule was deemed not to be a violation of human rights by the European Court of Human Rights in 2005, as it was part of France's decolonization process and was reconfirmed by Paris in 2007. The rule nonetheless deprived later immigrants of the ability to vote. The number of excluded voters increased from 8,000 in 1999 to 18,000 in 2009 and 42,000 in 2023. Of 220,000 national voters, only 178,000 were eligible to vote in local New Caledonian elections, meaning basically 1 out of every 5 people was excluded from participation. This was done to ensure representation of the Kanak. However, after 3 referendums in which voters opted to remain a part of France, the frozen electorate rule was deemed obsolete. Now, just for a bit more perspective here, the Kanak make up about 40% of New Caledonia's population, while the Kandush account for 45%. The rest of the population is made up of newer arrivals from France and other French territories, alongside a mix of people from Indonesia, Vietnam, and other Asian countries. Anyway, a bipartisan group was then sent by the National Assembly to consult with officials in New Caledonia and ultimately concluded that unfreezing the electorate was legal and a democratic necessity. It, however, advised against doing so immediately, noting that some Kanak groups believed it a means for demographic replacement. In particular, the group's report noted strong opposition from pro-independence parties like the Caledonian Union. The party's Secretary General, Dominique Fauci, who I should note uses the Kanak name for New Caledonia, Kanaky, is quoted as saying, "Is maintaining the settlement in Kanaky a democratic requirement? We cannot today continue to make the first people in their own country a minority and let parliamentarians who do not live here decide our future." Other members of the UC went further, declaring, "If you touch the electorate, it will be war. Our young people are ready to go. If we have to sacrifice 1,000, we will do so." Nonetheless, on April 2nd, the Senate, the French Parliament's upper house, voted to endorse constitutional amendments extending suffrage to those who had been residing in New Caledonia for an uninterrupted 10 years. 2 weeks later, pro-independence and loyalist groups organized competing rallies in Nouméa, which in total saw 40,000 attendees, or 15% of New Caledonia's population. That same day, back in Paris, the National Assembly, the French Parliament's lower house, voted in favor of the constitutional amendments by a margin of 351 to 153. And that more or less brings us to the present. Macron arrived in New Caledonia on May 22nd to listen, talk, and hold discussions with local officials in an attempt to restore order. What's more, Macron announced voting reforms will be delayed, saying he will reevaluate the situation in a month. But the situation remains tense. One thing you may not know, though, is what role Azerbaijan, allegedly, played in all of this. Yeah, so Azerbaijan, which traditionally had little presence in the Asia-Pacific and is nearly 8,700 miles away from New Caledonia, invited what it labeled as freedom fighters from the territories of Martinique, French Guiana, New Caledonia, and French Polynesia for a conference titled Towards the Complete Elimination of Colonialism back in July 2023. This resulted in the formation of the Baku Initiative Group, whose stated aim is to support the just struggle of the peoples suffering from the colonial policy of France. Photos and video also emerged of protesters in New Caledonia waving Azerbaijani flags before posters of the country's president, Ilham Aliyev. What's more, France has accused Baku of a coordinated disinformation campaign targeting French security forces in New Caledonia, saying a series of posts on X were published by accounts connected to the ruling New Azerbaijan Party. Azerbaijan's foreign ministry spokesman quickly denied these allegations, saying instead of accusing Azerbaijan of allegedly supporting pro-independence protests in New Caledonia, France should focus on its failed policy towards the overseas territories that led to such protests. That being said, Baku has expressed its anger over increased French military support for Armenia, especially in wake of the 2023 offensive in Nagorno-Karabakh. Having successfully stared down Russia in its conflict with Armenia, this bellicose approach to foreign policy may be intended to punish France, a longtime ally of Yerevan. It isn't without any risk for Baku, as France plays a crucial role in Azerbaijan's oil and natural gas industry. But with Europe desperate for non-Russian fuel sources, Paris may find that any meaningful economic response is not worth the cost here. So, only time will tell what role this emerging dynamic may play in the still ongoing New Caledonia unrest. I don't think I'll be giving a rating for all topics we cover in this more news-type format, but for New Caledonia at least, I'm going to give it a 6.5 on the Ghost Countries Index. France has postponed the voting reform for now and seems open to dialogue, but for many this still falls short of what they desire: independence. So while I do think the current situation is likely to calm down, especially before the upcoming Olympics, I feel questions about New Caledonia's status, undetermined status I should say, will continue to be an issue for Paris in the coming years. But as always, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Also, a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon, and if you'd like to help support the channel too, there's a link in the description.